work. When I look back on my life and the people that I've known who were in the ministry, or those that were planning on going into the ministry, or even just church going Christians that I've known, I've noticed something that bothers me a bit. Many of them are no longer in the ministry. Some are no longer even walking with the Lord. And I'm sure that you can think of folks that fall into that category as well. And for me, I wonder, how can the fire that burned so bright in these folks have been snuffed out? I suppose it happens for a number of reasons. Often it's because life just became too difficult. Some gave up because they were discouraged with the church. Some gave up because someone close to them died and they just couldn't ever understand why. Some gave up because their marriage crumbled. And I think for many Christian people, the underlying misconception, I can't even talk tonight, is that life is supposed to be easy, or at the very least is not supposed to be this hard. But there's nothing in the Bible to support that idea. In fact, the Bible teaches exactly the opposite. In the past 4 weeks, we've looked at things that will help you to keep your faith alive. That's kind of been the overarching theme for the last 4 weeks. The first one was nailing down the assurance of your salvation, putting your hope in Jesus alone. Number 2 was living the Spirit-filled life, learning to walk day by day in the power of the Holy Spirit. The third thing we looked at was how to cultivate the art of worship, not only in church on Sunday morning, but in your day-to-day life, spending time with God on a daily basis. Last week, we looked at how to handle the storms of life. And tonight is kind of a continuation of last week. In the first section of the message tonight, I want us to briefly look at what we need to know about the storms of life. And then in the second section, we're going to look at what we need to do about the storms of life. So the first thing you need to know is that storms happen to everyone. Now, on an intellectual level, we all know that this is true. And yet, when we're hit by a storm, our first reaction is often, this shouldn't be happening to me. I don't deserve this. Now, whether we deserve it or not, we all have to endure the occasional storm. None of us are strangers to the rain. Jesus said in Matthew 5:45, "For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." I've known folks over the years who've tried to defy that principle. They just thought that if they organized their life a certain way, if they could just get their income to a certain level, if they could just get a handle on their relationships, if they could just get their schedule under control, then there would be no more storms in their life. But that's not at all how it works, because the rain falls on everyone. Some storms are the result of our sinfulness and our own bad decisions, but many are not. My mother-in-law has been struggling with vision problems for years, and it's created quite a bit of a hardship for her and for her husband. When something like that happens, it's easy to ask, what did I do to cause this? Or what could I have done to prevent it? But a lot of the time, you'll simply have to blame your ancestors because it's hereditary, which it is with her. It's not her fault. You just have to endure the storm. So the first thing to remember is that storms happen to everyone. If your storms are the result of your bad behavior, clearly you need to change what you do. But if it's not your fault, you just need to accept the fact that storms happen to everyone. The rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous, and nothing will change that. Secondly, the pain doesn't last forever. If you've lost someone that you love, you need to remind yourself that the emptiness you feel won't last forever. There may be damage that you have to deal with. You may have to pick up the pieces and move on. You may have to rebuild your life. But the pain caused by the suddenness of the storm will not last forever. And thirdly, sometimes in the midst of the storm, God seems to be silent. In Mark 4, which we're going to be looking at this Sunday morning, Jesus and his disciples were in a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee, and suddenly a huge storm came up. Some translations call it a furious squall. And the boat began to rock. The waves were crashing against the vessel to the point that it almost capsized. And the disciples were convinced that if they were about to die, that it was going to come. I mean, they couldn't see any hope at that point. The wind was ferocious, and the disciples all panicked. And where was Jesus in the midst of all this? Mark 4:38 says that he was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. And I love that little detail that Mark adds. While the disciples were staring death in the face, Jesus was sleeping comfortably on a cushion. Now, of course, we know how the story ends. Jesus calmed the storm, and they made it safely to the other side of the sea. But that doesn't change the fact that in the midst of the storm, he seemed to be unaware of the crisis. Here's a cold, hard truth. There will be times when it seems like God isn't paying attention. There will be times when he is frustratingly silent. And during these times, all you can really do is cling to your faith. When we read about how the disciples panicked in the midst of the storm, we tend to think, how foolish of them. Why would they be afraid? Jesus was right there with them. Didn't they know that he was going to take care of them? But the same can be said about us. How foolish we are to be afraid when a storm comes. Because Jesus is right here with us. Don't we know that he's going to take care of us? in Hebrews 13:5, he said, "For he himself has said, I will never leave you or forsake you." So it may seem that God is unaware of the crisis in our lives, but we have his promise that he knows every detail, and he's with us every step of the way. So how should we respond to the storms of life? Well, let's talk about what we need to do about the storm. Being in a storm forces you to walk your talk. It forces you to put your faith into action. How do you do that? How do you walk your talk in the middle of a storm? Well, we're going to look at Psalm 107 to find out. Because there are three simple things to do when the storms of life are raging. First of all, cry out to God. In this psalm, David describes merchants experiencing the same kind of storm at sea that the disciples had experienced in Mark 4. And he says in Psalm 107, 25 through 27, he says, "He spoke and raised a tempest that stirred up the waves of the sea, rising up to the sky, sinking down to the depths, their courage melting away in anguish. They reeled and staggered like drunken men, and all their skill was useless." Somebody get a pen, Brandon. Oh, I'm sorry. That's okay. He's at the back. Thank you. In the back. Have you ever felt like you're at your wit's end? When the storm is so overwhelmingly destructive that you've run out of ideas? It's very possible that you're there right now. Maybe you've done everything you know to do, and if it feels like life is still crumbling all around you. Maybe you've done everything you know to do, and your children continue to rebel. Maybe you've done everything you know to do, and your health is still deteriorating. If you're at your wit's end, in the midst of the storm, you have two options. You can give up. You can decide that Christianity doesn't work after all, that your life is falling apart and God seems to be asleep. So we just need to forget about the whole thing. That's one option. Or you can do what the disciples did in Mark 4. They went to where Jesus was and woke him up. Look there in verse 38, Mark 4:38. It says, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" That's certainly not the most eloquent prayer that you can find in Scripture. But you have to admit, it was effective. In the midst of your storm, you need to do the same thing. Cry out to God and keep crying out to him until the storm has passed. Listen to how David put this in Psalm 107, verses 28 and 29. "Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a murmur, and the waves of the sea were hushed. I've heard people say, yeah, well, I tried that, and it didn't work. I cried out to God for help, and nothing happened. Well, let's be honest. I've actually thought the same thing at times. The question we need to ask is, how long? How long did you cry out? For an hour? For a day? For a week? It could very easily take longer than that. The idea is to pray as long as it takes to get an answer. Sometimes I think that we're not crying out to God in holy submission to Him. We're just snapping our fingers and demanding that He do our bidding. And there's a big difference. We need to cry out to Him in surrender to His lordship in such a way that we explicitly put our faith in Him. Lord, you're in control of the storm. You're in control of my life. And I trust you for the results. As we looked at before, the results may not always be what we think we want, but we can be sure that the results will always work out for our good. Romans 8:28 says, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, those who are called according to His purpose. In the midst of the storm, cry out to God and keep crying out for as long as you have breath, because He will hear you and He will bring you out of your distress. Secondly, we need to let God guide you. There's an amazing principle in the Christian life that I've seen folks forget before, including pastors and teachers and leaders and people who've been believers for decades. And again, yes, I've forgotten it too. And the principle is this: if you ask for God's guidance, He will give it to you. Now you can say, God, I've completely messed things up. What can I do to get back on track? And He will guide you. You can say, God, I've run my finances into the ground. What can I do to rebuild them? And He will guide you. You can say, God, my family has abandoned me and I'm all alone. How can I possibly make it on my own? And He will guide you. When we seek His guidance, He guides us. When we seek His direction, He gives us direction. When we place our future in His hands, He takes care of our future. Listen to what David wrote here in verse 30 of Psalm 107. They rejoiced when the waves grew quiet. Then He guided them to the harbor they longed for. Notice that. To the harbor they longed for. There's a place where you want to be. A place of peace, a place of security, a place of hope, comfort, and rest. a place of joy, love, and fulfillment. And He can get you there if you let Him guide you. You'll have to let Him map out the course. Now, the journey may take you on a route that you wouldn't have chosen for yourself. It may include some high winds and some hard rain. But if you follow His leadership, He'll get you to the harbor you long for. Let God guide you. I know what some of you are probably thinking. Well, that's great advice. But how? How do I let God guide me? Well, learning to follow the leadership of God is a lifelong process. But I'm convinced that about 80% is a matter of the heart. If we truly want to make the right decision, He will reveal the right decision to us. Many, many years ago, when my niece and nephews were still little kids, so it was many years ago, my mom decided to have an Easter egg hunt for the grandkids in her backyard. My brothers and I hid the eggs around in her backyard. Some of the eggs were a little harder to find, but the older kids didn't seem to be having that much trouble finding them. We kept giving hints to my youngest nephew, who was around 3 at the time, I think. We'd say things like, maybe there are some eggs over by the wagon, and so on. And everyone was readily finding all the eggs, all except the younger one. He could have cared less about the whole Easter egg thing. He didn't care about finding any eggs. He was more interested in pulling flowers and chasing the cat. But the older kids appreciated the hints that we were giving all along the way. This is how God gives us guidance. If we're looking for the eggs, He gives us hints. Obvious hints sometimes, to make sure that we find them. If we're not looking for the eggs, no amount of hints is going to help. Having God guide you to your desired haven of rest begins with turning your heart towards Him. Open your eyes, look for His guidance. Open your ears and listen to His leading, because He will guide you. And the third thing you need to do about the storm is remember God's faithfulness. I began this sermon by mentioning that I've known some people over the years who've stopped walking with the Lord. For whatever reason, they chose to forget about God's prior faithfulness. When the storms of life came, they didn't remember God's provision in the past. And therefore, they didn't see any hope for the future. So they gave up in the present. Here's my challenge to you. When you're going through the storm, make an effort to remember all that God has done for you in the past. David wrote Psalm 77 while he was going through a time of trial himself. In Psalm 77, verses 8 through 12, it says, "Has His faithful love ceased forever? Is His promise at an end for all generations? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He in anger withheld His compassion? So I say, I am grieved that the right hand of the Most High has changed. I will remember the Lord's works. Yes, I will remember your ancient wonders. I will reflect on all you have done and meditate on your actions. And he says something very similar in Psalm 107, verses 31 through 32. He says, let them give thanks to the Lord for his faithful love and his wonderful works for all humanity. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people and praise him in the council of the elders. He's saying, once you get through the storm, talk about it. Sing praise to God. Tell everyone how good God has been to you. Because God will get you through this storm like he's done in the past. When it happens, remember to thank him. I read a quote a while back that said, if I never experience another miracle or receive another blessing, it's okay. I've already been given more than enough to last a lifetime. And in truth, that's probably true for all of us. The blessings and miracles never end. And having an attitude of gratitude gets you through the crisis. When the storms of life are raging, our attitude needs to be, God, you've already given me so much more than I deserve. I trust you to get me through this storm. Even though storms happen to everyone, they have a way of making you feel like you're the only one that this has ever happened to. They make it seem like God has forgotten you while you're overcome with the crisis. But regardless of how you feel, that isn't the case, because God's with you and he will get you through it. Now is the time to cry out to him, and keep crying as long as you have breath. Now is the time to let him guide you. Turn your heart to him and to anticipate his leadership. And now is the time to remember his faithfulness. Thank him for all that he's done for you in the past. And prepare even now to thank him for seeing you through this storm. And while you're at it, maybe the next one too. Take out your prayer sheets, if you would.